Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Eco-Mythbusters Roundtable, the podcast where we debunk, discuss, and discover the truth behind environmental myths. Joining us today, we have Mr. Shubhajit Dey. He is a mechanical engineer with deep expertise in energy systems. He is a passionate researcher, engineer, and business strategist, and he has over 25 years of corporate experience. It's a pleasure to have you today, Mr. Dey.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So the topic for today is, are electric vehicles green? I hope you have enjoyed the blog on the same topic. If you haven't read it yet, you can download it from the website attached in the link in the description of my YouTube channel. Please go ahead and read that. So let's start off with a fundamental question. If someone asks you, are electric vehicles green? What's your one sentence answer?
Responding to EVs being green is like calling credit card money as free money. It feels fantastic spending, but you need to remember that there's a bill that's coming that you have to pay for. So electric vehicles are not green to start with. They are not green under certain circumstances. They only become cleaner over a period of time. It essentially means they have a lot of emissions debt that they are born with. It's almost like, just like I said, a credit card bill. EVs can also be thought of as a restaurant which does not have a kitchen. Just because you can't see the kitchen doesn't mean the kitchen doesn't exist somewhere.
That really is a wonderful analogy, Mr. Dey. Thank you so much. So, given you have already established that you believe electric vehicles are not green initially and they are green over a period of time, and they do have a massive footprint that they leave behind, let me ask you this. What are two ways in which electric vehicles are green, and what are two ways in which they aren't?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question because it comes in different shades of gray. So two ways in which EVs are green, let's think of them. So when EVs are flying on the road, they are clean because there is no tailpipe to the car and there is no emission coming off the tailpipe. So when the car moves on the road, they are relatively cleaner than the conventional gasoline engine. In engineering terms, you call this that the emission is not distributed. And I'll come back to this later. The second area or theme where I personally think EVs are green is one of the most underrated greenness, which is the noise pollution. Noise pollutions in urban centers, especially in cities, are a common reason for lots of health issues, stresses. People do not talk about them. Now, EVs are built with fewer parts. They have less vibrations for different reasons. Hopefully, we'll discuss those through this podcast. But what it means is that EVs fly quieter. And thus, there is way lesser acoustic pollution. That is the second area in which I think EVs are green. And then you ask me two areas where EVs aren't green. So the first area goes back to what I just said. They have a massive amount of manufacturing hangover. Now, how do you make EVs? You have batteries, you still need steel bodies or aluminum bodies. Each of these have to be mined. There is a manufacturing process. So there's a lot of emissions already happening. It's just that the emissions are happening somewhere else, not on the road. Just because you are not seeing something coming out of the tailpipe doesn't mean it's not emitting. Zero emission on tailpipe doesn't mean zero footprint. So they are not green unless you change the factories, unless you rewire how industries and factories are built. So that's one area where EVs are not green. The second area where EVs are not green is a no-brainer, which is it's as green as the grid in which you are plugging it to for charging. If you are plugging it to a grid which runs completely on solar or wind, it's 100% green. But if you are running it on a grid which feeds off gas or coal, means dirty grid, the EV cannot be clean. It's just that it has been dusted and there is dust in the backdrop. So these are two areas where I think EVs are not green, and it's important that your audience thinks through these and understands them with clarity.
You heard him, and thank you so much for the point on noise pollution as well, because I was just thinking we are sitting next to a highway right now, And my goodness, am I jealous of the audience who aren't getting to hear that beautiful melody right now of the horns of the trucks and just constantly scratching along the gravel. It really is a menace.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next question. How are electric vehicles structurally engineered differently from traditional fuel engines, and how does that make them environmentally beneficial this time? I believe your expertise in mechanical engineering will provide us some really
Yes,
thoughtful insights here.
I've had the opportunity of talking about aerodynamics of road vehicles and road vehicle constructions to some other colleagues in the past. They're structurally very different, EVs. Why? So let's think of an analogy. If you think of a conventional gasoline engine, it is essentially an iron box within which there are a series of controlled explosions happening. You call those engines. So a conventional gasoline engine is an iron box built around an engine to contain explosions, a fuel tank, and a very long exhaust manifold, exhaust system. EVs, on the other hand, structurally have way fewer parts because it doesn't have any explosions to deal with. It feeds off a battery, right? So think of EVs, on the other hand, as a giant smartphone rolling on wheels. So essentially, your whole concept or mindset has to now shift from a mechanical mindset to a digital/chemical mindset. Digital being that smartphone rolling on the wheels, chemical as in the battery, right? What does all of this mean? What all of this means is that EVs have fewer parts, which means fewer things to worry about, fewer things that will fail. So they should ideally have longer longevity. Because there are no explosions to control inside EVs, unlike gasoline engines where there's a spike in pressure, there's an explosion inside the cylinder and everything happens, there are less vibrations. Because there are less vibrations, there are less wear and tear. There are lesser acoustic signals, meaning it makes lesser noise. It's a lot smoother ride. It doesn't have a tailpipe, so you don't see the smoke out, right? On the other hand, however, while I sing all this glory, don't forget that it feeds off a battery. And the battery itself is not only a chemistry project or a chemical puzzle, it also has other impact. A battery is born with almost 80 to 90% more net emissions than a conventional gasoline engine. So you can imagine if a gasoline engine is born with this much of carbon debt, and EV is born with deeper red carbon debt. And that it has to make up through its life. It has to pay for its karma, right, at some point. It also is important to remember that batteries need cobalt, nickel, lithium, and we typically don't recycle a lot these days. The total recycling of lithium is just 5%, which means you are literally moving mountains. You are moving gallons of water, right? So it is structurally very different, but it brings other kinds of problems. Sometimes, I have friends who like to believe that EVs are not a solution to climate issues. EVs are about moving the monkey from one shoulder to the other shoulder, which means you're just shifting the problem. So in this particular case where I was trying to give you an example is you are possibly shifting a carbon problem eventually into a toxicity problem. But that's a different topic. Hopefully you have understood that EVs are made up of a simpler and lesser number of structural components, different materials.
Definitely.
It deals with different kinds of mechanical problems.
Yeah, that's really, really insightful. And actually, I'm still hung onto the point where he talks about the life cycle of a battery, which actually brings me on to my next question, before which I would like to mention to the audience that directly aligning with that point is a very interesting case study that I've studied in the past. It is about the accumulation of electronic wastes in West Africa. I believe I've mentioned it in my blog as well. So you guys should definitely read up on that. It will really allow you to expand your knowledge on this concept.
That's a very interesting one. I don't know much about electronic waste accumulation in West Africa. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll possibly go look up your blog.
Thank you so much. So moving on to the life cycle of an electric vehicle now. Can you walk us through, well, the life cycle of an electric vehicle and the battery, how it is used, how it is made, and its end of life journey?
Yeah, that is pretty much the life cycle. Let me rephrase what you said.
Yes.
Let's think of it as 3 stages, but let's think of it as debt, payback, and the legacy. Why did I say this? Because it aligns with our ongoing conversation. So when an EV is born, it's born with a massive amount of manufacturing hangover. I just said this. It has a lot of carbon debt. Where is this debt coming from? It's coming from the fact that it needs all kinds of materials, fabrication and manufacturing and extraction of which has a huge carbon footprint. Steel making, aluminum, copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, right? The factories and the industries that are associated with the supply chain to make your EV do not have zero carbon footprint. So an EV is born with a lot of carbon debt. It starts with a deep red in its greenness index. So that's where it starts. That's how it starts, and that's where the footprint is. Then as it goes through its life, that's the payback period. It has to pay for this karma and cleanse itself. It has to clean itself up. So as it plies on the roads, it's not doing those distributed pollution anymore. That's cleanness. It's breathing clean, as we call it, which is great, by the way, because you don't want to walk around in a city with smogs.
Definitely.
Right? So it's much better to deal with concentrated emissions somewhere else. We'll talk about that later. But then remember, there's a catch to this payback. It will only be truly clean and green if the grid from which it is being charged is clean and green. It has to be plugged into a solar-fed or wind-fed grid only. If you are still feeding it into a coal or gas-fed grid, the payback is not zero, or the payback is not payback, right? So that's the second phase, right? And that tells you where it would have its footprint. The legacy again goes back, the end of life. Legacy goes back to what I said a few minutes back. I can go through component by component. It'll make your podcast very long, but let's just focus on the heart of the EV, the battery. It has some toxic material in it, lithium, cobalt, nickel. And I just told you that lithium is not recycled. Hardly 5% is recycled. So people go and mine lithium again. But imagine a world in the future version where you are able to recoup 90 to 95% of the lithium. Then you are churning the same lithium over and over again, the same copper over and over again, the same cobalt, nickel, right? And relatively, it's becoming cleaner and cleaner. So hopefully that tells you where the issues are and how it goes through its life cycle of, the debt with which it is born, the payback through which it lives its life, and then as it dies, the legacy that needs to be cared for.
That really is an interesting analogy, Mr. Subrajit. And aside from the environmental impacts itself, let's not forget about the ethical impacts at all of these stages.
Yeah.
When you're mining for the lithium, there's workers risking their lives. There's workers with families who are dealing with toxic materials, going deep into underground caves and tunnels to extract these materials, dealing with toxic gases released while you are smelting these ores.
Yeah.
So it really shows how much of a debt these electric vehicles are actually born with, and the legacy that they leave behind, as you said.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point you make. It's almost like, saying that I would have a very efficient vacuum cleaner to clean my floor. That's great. And you can pump a lot of money into building the world's best vacuum cleaner. But a smarter thing is not to throw dirt on the floor in the first place.
That does make a lot of sense. So moving on, now that we have discussed the impact perspective, let's look at some of the solutions. So what kind of infrastructural support do you believe would be required to optimize the eco-friendly benefits of the electric vehicles? And aside from it, also talk about the feasibility of the solutions you present.
Okay. That's a good question. The first one that comes to my mind is the grid. An EV is as clean as the grid is.
I was just thinking of the same.
Right? So you know what I'm going to say. The point is, the grid in which an EV needs to be charged has to become increasingly green. In an ideal state, it has to be completely fed off renewables, which is solar or wind. So let's stick to the first point and then talk of your second part of the question as well, the feasibility. India, 100% feasible. India has a lot of sun. So not having solar here is not a very smart idea. We can definitely do it. The question is, it's not only about having small islands of solar grid. The whole planet that you and I live on is made up of several systems that are interconnected: a social system, an economic system, an energy system, a financial system, a legal system. You have to rewire the earth eventually. So it is feasible, but with challenges, right? Wind, different parts of India has different amounts of wind and grades of wind, but solar, I'm very positive it can happen. The second thing about EV is, think of the braking. And I remember when you were a kid, you had asked me this question once, that what happens when you are braking a car? When you are braking a car, you are essentially rubbing two metals against each other. What happens? It creates friction. What after the friction? The friction generates some heat. What about heat? Heat is lost energy.
Yes.
There's no way you can bring that energy back. But where did this energy come from? The gasoline in the tank.
Yes.
And where did the gasoline come from? Some carbon source. In an EV, on the other hand, it runs on a motor. The moment you take your feet off the pedal, the motor starts rotating in a reverse direction, which means the motor now acts as a generator.
Yes.
So the fact that you are now retarding is essentially capturing the kinetic energy and charging your battery back. So braking is also green. That's the second part.
Wow, I never would have thought of it that way.
Right? Well, that's how EVs work. The third point you have to think through is, how do you really do smart load management? Kind of stuff that you and your colleagues and friends do, right? The AI stuff. Why do I say that? Think of the feasibility perspective. Think of Bangalore. At 7 p.m. in the evening or 8 p.m. in the evening, if there are 1,000 or 1,500 people plugging their EVs to the grid, the transformers are going to explode.
Exactly.
So how do you load balance this? No one has ever spoken about this problem in its completeness yet. At least I have not read any article or paper. This load management is spoken about. It's a nice phrase that goes around, but no one has yet spoken about what is the core solution of this load management, load optimization. Forget 1,000, 1,500. I mean, in Bangalore, if I were to think of an extreme, at a given point in time, in a few seconds, it's not going to be 1,500 cars being plugged. It's going to be 1 million or close to 1 million and a half. Imagine what will happen. The whole grid would go up in smoke.
Absolutely.
So these are some things to think about, right? Cleaning up your grid, smart load management, braking systems. And I also hopefully touched on some of the feasibilities in terms of highlighting the infeasibility of it. That doesn't mean it's infeasible. It just means it requires informed engineering rather than blind optimism or blind environmentalism.
That's a really great perspective. And thank you so much for giving me such a unique selling point for my podcast as well. Even I don't think I've heard anyone speak about the feasibility in that aspect, in terms of how many people are charging together, the load management. And aside from all of this, I think it's also a matter of how much our governments are willing to do it, which is completely out of our control as well. So
yeah, governments are willing to do quite a bit of it. If you think of the Indian government, it has policies, it has incentives. Are they enough? No, they are not enough. At the same time, it is a give and take. We as citizens, we also need to be more conscious, more open-eyed in the choices of our consumption, in the choices of our behaviors, which I think is something that your generation, I see, is being way smarter than the previous generations, way more prudent than the previous generations. So continue doing that and things will change. Change takes time. As I said, you have to rewire the planet.
Absolutely.
It's not about changing the grid infrastructure of one apartment housing 600 families. It's about rewiring the entire planet.
Great. And aligning with what you just said, rewiring the planet, I move on to my final question. If you could change just one thing in our city, Bengaluru, this year to maximize the benefits of electric vehicles, what would it be? And again, aligning with what you just said, what can us citizens do to support it?
The answer to you, the second part of your question in my mind is very easy. Be choiceful, be prudent, be honest, and be informed. You know, environmentalism isn't about passion. It's about competency. We forget that you need to be competent to talk about it, to think about it, to practice it. That's what we citizens should do. If there's one thing we should do this year in Bangalore, I would go back to the sun. Switch from oil to the sun, but do it in a very prudent manner. There's enough sunlight in Bangalore. Bangalore is one of the most techized cities in the world, forget India. If not here, where? I would say leverage government incentives, leverage citizen awareness and will to make not going solar very expensive. If there's a mechanism you and your group, your generation can make not going solar or not going renewable very expensive, people will go solar. At the end of the day, you know where it hurts? It hurts in the pocket. So we can talk about all the engineering, we can talk about all the passion, we can talk about the supply chain, how it functions, we can talk about how materials move. Eventually, it's about following the money. So that's a very long answer to a short question. A short answer is I would prioritize going solar.
Great. And thank you so much for that long answer, as a matter of fact. And I really do think that this has been a very insightful conversation. You have shown me things about EVs I couldn't have even imagined are aspects of electric vehicles that need to be evaluated to make sure the infrastructure runs properly.
You know, EVs are a nice example of an extremely successful branding campaign. That's why we think it's green.
Yes.
It is much easier to think that if I buy an EV, I will solve the climate problem, rather than thinking of how I'm going to change the factories and plants and industry.
Definitely.
Right? So essentially, we are looking at the symptom. An EV goes past you, there is no smoke coming out of the tailpipe. So you're looking at the symptom and you are trying to believe that because the symptom doesn't exist, the disease, in this case carbon, doesn't exist. Because we are very visual humans. And this green campaign has taken advantage of that. In fact, I really think EVs as green is an indicator of how successful a branding campaign has happened.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Dey, for joining me in my podcast today. I have definitely learned a lot. I hope the audience has learned a lot. Feel free to rewatch it as many times as you would like. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and I shall see you again soon. So, Brigitte Dey, would you like to sign off for me?
Thank you very much for a wonderful conversation. And this podcast is going to draw a lot of comments. I look forward to learning about those from you. So like, subscribe, and comment.
I look forward to reading those comments.